Good evening. This is I'm sitting in front of the organ, but this is not this is not a musical session, but rather a talk about something that does rather concern me. That I've been having some correspondence with a gentleman in the United States of America. I won't mention his name because I don't even know his name, but he put things to me that sort of half ring in my mind, and that some other things that cause me anxiety, and other things that I've heard it all before and become very skeptical about it. So this is I'm going to express myself very honestly about some of these things. First of all, he asked me what I thought about the Christian Reconstruction movement in the United States. I had to look it up on Wikipedia. The idea seems to be one that is often called integralism or integralism, meaning the union of religion and state, and the state being run according to the religion's principles, especially moral and legal principles. And my first impression was, here we go again, because I've seen this in France with attempts to well, I wouldn't say to bring about, but at least to dream about the great Pope and the great monarch and the restoration of the French kingdom. Well, perhaps that would be a good thing in the absolute, but it's certainly not something we need to be spending time on just at the moment. But the American version of Christian integralism, especially when the religion concerned is fundamentalist Protestantism or some kind of Calvinism or puritanism, the red lights started flashing in my mind, and I thought about the film The Handmaid's Tale, which is a dystopian film about what might happen if Christian fundamentalism brought about a totalitarian state. Which really would not be very different from the Taliban in Afghanistan or Daesh in Syria or other Muslim countries. And the same thing is in Orwell's 1984, and the real historical examples of totalitarianism being Hitler's Nazism, Stalin's communism, from the time the Bolsheviks came into full control, and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I was particularly horrified in reading some years ago about a Republican senator in America who advocated the execution, the putting to death of rebellious children simply for rebelling against their parents. I think that is absolutely awful. Merely because you might find a reference to such a thing in the book of Deuteronomy or such other sources. It's absolutely such an idea is absolutely unacceptable. There are ways to deal with children I think most of us, well, we all have been children at some time. We all have been adolescents, and we became rebellious because we had a reason, at least a subjective reason. We may have been wrong, because usually parents have more experience of life than children and adolescents. But killing children or adolescents, their parents, having them executed by a judgment of a court of law, I think such a thing was done away with in America towards the end of the 19th century. And thank goodness for that, because it's just unacceptable. Another issue I've always had with America, the United States of America, we are culturally very, very, very different. Of course, the white people in America are for the most part of English descent, many of Irish descent, others from other European countries. It was a melting pot of cultures. But as a whole, even though they came to our rescue in 1944, and together we beat the Nazis and liberated France and the rest of Europe, leading to the end of the war in the spring of 1945. But the Americans don't, or at least Republican, right-wing Americans, just don't seem to have any idea of what we experienced collectively in Europe. I didn't personally experience it. Hitler was dead 14 years before I was born. But my grandfather was a prisoner of war in an Oflag near Linz in what is now Austria. My mother used to tell us about the planes flying overhead and fighting and machine gunning each other, and then sometimes a plane would come crashing down in the field. She remembered the Battle of Britain. She was a young girl of 10 down in the south of England. And I've spoken with many people who have those experiences. And what caused that experience, what caused that war, was the madness of that of Hitler, and the way he was able to stir up base and primitive instincts in his people, the dark side of humanity, which is in all of us, myself included. All of us, we can be dragged into that kind of movement, and egged on by somebody who seems to have a very reasonable message, and it just descends into utter insanity. But Americans, at least the ones I mentioned, the kind of Americans I mentioned, they don't have that reserve because of that bitter experience. They still think in those terms, whereas we Europeans have been told we have to think in a different way, because the world cannot survive that kind of war being repeated. And many ideas going around seem to mix a kind of reversion to ancient Judaism with a few Christian terms, acknowledging Christ as the Messiah, but that's about all, and mixing that with nihilism, with Orwellian nihilism, and the Übermensch, the overman, which has different meanings in Nietzsche's philosophy. I do believe that our states and confederations are too big and anonymous. They depend on force and terror to work in their worst forms. I notice how the current COVID-19 pandemic is being mismanaged and politicized in many countries. We don't know what to believe. I'm not a scientist. I don't have access to all the science. I look at quite a lot of internet sites and YouTube talks, and sometimes I can get some very good ideas from people like Dr. John Campbell in the north of England, who is a virologist and has seems to have no political bias to the information he gives, and that's a very good channel to go to. I don't know how this virus came about. Nobody really knows, or perhaps some people do, but have vested interests, so as not to say. But I am very worried about China, Chinification, the rise of authoritarianism in the countries in which I live. And I say that as somebody who has always been very careful about the virus, observing the instructions were given, and I've had 2 vaccinations, and I'm due to have my 3rd in January. But still, I'm very reserved. I'm very frightened about the way things can go, especially in Australia, where I've heard of concentration camps or quarantine camps, and some very, very unhappy people. Well, utopia doesn't exist in this life. It never will do, because we are all a mixture of light and darkness. But perhaps the best unit of human society is the tribe. Some Western people have attempted to go back to the life of the tribe. I don't know how it can work in modernity, whilst we use technology and buy things that are made in China, because they're a lot cheaper and we can afford them. So maybe the only thing I can say is what I've been saying quite recently in different moments, including my musical videos. The only answer we can give to evil and chaos is goodness, truth and beauty, the 3 transcendentals of Plato. I can contribute music, I can contribute thought and writing. I don't go on demonstrations, I don't commit violence. It's not my way. Maybe I'm a coward, but really it's not something that my conscience would call me to do. So I try to do good through these modest means, like the organ behind me. Some say that the pen is mightier than the sword. Perhaps it's even mightier when it writes music rather than words. Cinema is a great art form that has arisen in the 20th century and our own century, and many messages are conveyed by cinema and films. It's certainly my experience. I very much enjoy watching films, good films, old ones as well as new ones. It's a different experience from reading novels. But a good film is one that conveys a message. I remember very vividly the film Mission with, oh dear, I can't remember the name, a very, very brilliant English actor. Mission that came out in 1984. And the Brazil, what became Brazil, but it was still a wild country with traditional tribes, and the Jesuits went and played music to them, Western music, Gabriel's oboe, which is a very haunting tune in this film, and he goes and plays the oboe in the jungle. And they were some of the most selfless men in history. They went to preach the gospel, but at the same time respected the self-governance of those peoples, the Guarani, the very famous tribes who made some of the best violins of the 18th century. And at the end of the film, Father Gabriel is seen leading the people with a monstrance and the Blessed Sacrament in his hands, and singing hymns to our Lord and to Our Lady, and praying that they may be delivered from the atheistic, rationalist Portuguese come to enslave them. And there was Rodrigo, and I think if you remember Rodrigo, I assume that most people watching this video have seen that film. Very, very monumental film. That Rodrigo killed his brother in a duel in a city in what became Brazil, and he gave up on life and was, I think if I remember rightly, he went into a psychiatric hospital, into a lunatic asylum as they would have called it in those days, and Father Gabriel went to find him, and he eventually repented of having killed his brother in a duel, and so his penance, shall we say, was to go on the missions where he'd been plundering and enslaving local tribal people, and that now that he would be serving them instead of enslaving them. And so the first part of his penance was to carry a big net of pieces of armour and swords and other weapons, and he would drag this bag with him all the way to the top of the waterfalls. And then when they reached the top, he was absolutely exhausted, and Father Gabriel cut the rope with his knife, and the net of weapons plunged down to the bottom of the waterfalls and fell into the water. And at the end of the film, Rodrigo went to where the weapons had sunk into the water, fished them out, and brought them back. And his approach was to fight and kill. And both were killed by the Portuguese. The result was exactly the same, but I think it's quite obvious who was right. It was the man who faced the Portuguese with God, and not with weapons, not with violence. I'm opposed to puritanism and iconoclasm, that I see this person at least asking questions about. I'm much more favourable to a Christianity that melts into the world where it finds itself, becomes incarnate. This is how it happened in the early days of the church. For example, the Feast of All Saints and All Souls is the old pagan Feast of the Dead. Christmas is set on the dates of the Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. That's to say, the winter solstice, from which the days would begin to become longer. And there are many things, Harvest, Thanksgiving, and many of these other festivals that have been baptized by Christianity and given new meaning. The same thing happened with some of the old pagan religions of Greece and Rome. And this is how the Christ brought the revelation of God and opened it to the Gentiles. It was no longer restricted to the people of Israel, but open to all. And this is the genius of Christianity. I think it is a great mistake to want to go back to the old laws of Deuteronomy and an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and this legalism that indeed Christ himself denounced when he said, "Woe to you, scribes and hypocrites and Pharisees, you lay burdens on people's backs and will not carry anything yourselves." And all these especially in St. Matthew's Gospel, it's also beautifully expressed. We can imagine what Christ actually experienced as a young Jewish man in Israel, with the clericalism and legalism of the scribes and Pharisees. And this is what happened again in the church. And it's also what happened in the Reformation. Many of the Reformation ideas at the very beginning were against the corruption in the clergy in the Roman Catholic Church. And then it assumed a kind of Phariseeism of its own. It's indeed what happens really to all religions when they become institutionalized. And rather than deny the truth of Christ and Christianity, we always have to be on the lookout for this kind of process of institutionalization and legalism that enters into our faith, into what Christ actually brought us. This gentleman in America, he suggested three possibilities, two optimistic ideas, one being the kind of thing that I tend to go along with, perennialism, Plato, mysticism. That's the kind of thing I would go along with. The second was this kind of Neo-Judaism. And the third, he mentions, very pessimistic, would be simply the world of Richard Dawkins, materialism. We're just blobs of matter, that came into being by random over millions of years, and we live and we die, and after death there is nothing, because anything that happens in our minds is just chemicals creating reactions in the brain. And once that's dead, it's all over. It's finished. So there's nothing. And if that were true, well, there is no purpose to life. Why live? And indeed, many people who go along that way of thinking, they go quietly nuts. They go crazy. They go mad, and eventually they commit suicide. A dreadful thing. We all have the only thing that can bring our society's ills to good is to look into ourselves, is to find God. And indeed, Jesus said, "I came not to destroy the law and the prophets. If any man teach you to disobey the least of the commandments, he will be called least in the kingdom." The 10 Commandments indeed are eternal, and but sometimes they do require some interpretation. That's why we have a branch of theology that we call moral theology, is to know what is right and what is wrong, what we can do, what we can't do, and what we can do under certain circumstances but not in other circumstances. That is discernment, that is moral theology. And so we can't go by a fundamentalist system that from which grave injustices will occur. And I can see this happening in the Muslim world, or shall I say the radical Muslim world of Daesh. They just kill people, they just go around cutting throats and shouting Allahu Akbar, which would mean God be praised, which is a grotesque parody of prayer in taking somebody's life, supposedly for the rule of Sharia over the people. It's absolutely grotesque. There was a priest near Rouen, Father Hamel. He was just peacefully getting ready to say Mass in his parish, and 2 men went into the church, and one of them cut the priest's throat. For what? What did the priest do against these 2 men claiming, or perhaps who actually were radical Muslims? What did he do? But yet he was martyred. He was martyred for the faith. He was martyred for Christ. Well, there are many things in this world. Indeed, nobody seems to be completely right. The Roman Catholic Church has committed many horrible things in history, with the Inquisition and the Crusades and many other things. In 17th century Europe, most of the witch hunting was done by Puritans in Holland and in England, Cromwell's lot, and in various other countries. Also the Reformed Christians in France. They went after witches. They tortured them. They burnt them at the stake, or they hanged them, or whatever. And perhaps most of these women, they were just into herbal remedies and faith healing, and most of it quite harmless. But yet, what happened in the 17th century, there was the Maunder Minimum. There were many famines because of very, very cold winters, and it was all blamed on the witches. And this happens again and again and again in history. We had this with the witch hunts, and then we had this under Hitler, who went after the Jews. And if we're not careful now, I don't approve of people who won't be vaccinated against COVID, but to reduce them to an Untermensch, to a subhuman species, this is very, very, very dangerous. So any attempt to persuade me towards a neo-Talmudic, neo-Judaism for Christians meets with a visceral resistance, because it doesn't ennoble man. It doesn't give an aristocracy of spirit. When I say aristocracy, I don't mean people who are born into lords and marquises families, or the royal family, not by birth, but by education and spiritual elevation. And what I mean by education is teaching in history, in questions of virtue, in questions of humanity, much before teaching children just to pass examinations. There needs to be an elite of people who understand and who know what the old Gnostics used to call, or the Gnostics were so called after the word in Greek, gnosis, which means knowledge, but a spiritual knowledge. And many of the Gnostics went too far in their division of themselves from the unwashed masses, from the people who were considered to be like animals. Sometimes I wonder, but it's not. But this is not human. This is not Christian to judge others as rabble or as animals to be exploited. But the history of humanity corresponds with the life of a person. One very interesting point about this kind of fundamentalism and legalism that I've been talking about is we teach children to behave through a system of rewards and punishments. We do the same thing with animals. It's called the theory of Pavlov. With the use of rewards and punishments, you can modify their behaviour. Well, this is fine for training dogs and horses and other animals that work for humans, for a little bit of food or a nice pat on the head or something like that. But the child then, after such a basic training in good behaviour, needs to learn much more about true virtue, about spiritual values, of humanism, of loving others, or at least respecting others, and being and caring for the other's good, even for a stranger I don't know. But I do care about somebody who is in difficulty. I have several times saved a life. For example, I am a destitute woman in London who jumped into the Thames, and I went in and fished her out. And a particularly unpleasant experience, but it was something I had to do. I had no choice about it. That was my human duty. Well, then this man, he brought up something with me that very much resonated in me. The question of what is my position with other people if I'm part of that romantic, Platonic vision of Christianity? Is it all about me, me, me? Well, I have to say that I'm the only person I've experienced, at least fully, and even then, getting to know myself is a long piece of work throughout my life. Another person can become a friend, or somebody I can love very closely, or a member of my family. And those people, I know a lot more about them, and I begin to know them, and they enter into my life in some way. With strangers, it's very difficult, especially I have been diagnosed with Asperger's autism, and the stereotype would say that we have no empathy, no idea about somebody else's expressions or thoughts. Well, that isn't strictly true, at least in my case. I do feel very acutely, but maybe only on certain parts, certain aspects of that life, and maybe others I'm a little less sensitive. Well, I have another experience of life. I don't make an identity issue of it, but I have another experience of life. But what I have become very interested in is the spiritual and philosophical aspect. What Rob Riemann, a Dutch author and philosopher, calls the nobility of spirit, can be something dangerous, because we can imagine ourselves as superior to others. But many things are dangerous in this life. Even just driving a car on the road, or going sailing, or anything. There's always a risk with everything, but it has to be a measured risk. It has to be a calculated risk. The question of Gnosticism in the history of the Church also needs a lot of distinctions made between the quite wild theories that came out and that were written down in some of the old manuscripts, and there was a more measured kind of Gnosticism that you would find with fathers of the church like Clement of Alexandria or Origen. A very different and a much more compatible mystical Christianity that was compatible with Orthodox Christianity, and was able to be maintained in a moderate form so that it would last through the centuries, rather than something that would become crazy, that would become mad, that would become immoderate, and eventually would die, as many of the ancient mystery religions did. Like Mithra, for example, nobody practices the sacrifices of bulls and the eating by lying on your stomach, both sides of the altar in the middle of the temple. I've seen Mithra temples in, for example, the crypt under San Clemente in Rome. There are many others of them, and these mystery religions disappeared. But in Christianity there has always been an element of Gnosticism, of orthodox Gnosticism, of Gnosticism that is compatible with the creeds and the theological tradition. But in Calvinism, like in Pharisaism at the time of Christ, or perhaps some versions of Orthodox Judaism today, I don't know. I have no experience of the ways they go. Certainly in fundamentalist Islam, it's a lid of lead. It's a sarcophagus that enslaves people, that makes people unthinking, I don't know what, zombies perhaps. I think if that were the only way, if that kind of monotheism was the only way, I couldn't follow it. Would I be an atheist? Would I be an agnostic? I don't know what I would do. But it's not the case. It's not the case. Many had the guts to live through the Nazi regime. I don't know if I'd lived in those days. Perhaps I think I would have died of a broken heart if I hadn't known the future and when the liberation would come. But usually in such adversity, God gives us the strength to endure and to come out of it triumphant. Well, I think the subject of this was the question of Christian society and humanism. This book of Rob Riemann, Nobility of Spirit, A Forgotten Ideal. It's just a very thin book, but it's very, very profound, and I would like to recommend it to you. I'll show you the flyleaf if I can find it. Wait a minute. That's the second. Here we are. It's nice and clearly written there. Nobility of Spirit, A Forgotten Ideal by Rob Riemann. And this book can be found from Amazon or from any good bookshop. It's published by Yale University Press, so one of the most prestigious universities of the United States. And in the contents, I think probably the most important chapter is what is called the Quest of Thomas Mann. And Thomas Mann was a poet and an author who was German, and he saw the rise of Nazism in Germany, and he got out. He emigrated, and he wrote many very, very profound works. For example, when catastrophe came, it was only fitting that Thomas Mann should, in the tragic shadow of Luther, of Goethe and of Nietzsche, create what is probably the only work of fiction, Dr. Faustus, commensurate with its theme. So that's one of his works, where you will find, in analogy, many of these ideas of searching for one's soul. I read this as well. What commands Rob Riemann's particular fidelity, however, as well as the ideals of the Nexus Institute, it's an institute he runs in the Netherlands, is that particular humanism, of which Mann was, perhaps, the last encompassing representative. That's remarkable. And what is humanism? It's we being humans and obeying maybe the great commandment of God is to love the Lord thy God and to love thy neighbour as thyself. These are the two great commandments on which hang all the law and the prophets. And I think if we can understand that we can learn to love, we can learn to be ourselves, we can learn to respect others, even when they are different from ourselves in some way, or perhaps they are less well developed in their thought or their spirituality. Another aspect of humanism is art and culture and beauty. There are people today where there are people identifying with what's generally called now the woke movement, whose slogan is cancel culture. This happened also in history. This happened with the Russian Revolution in the early part of the 20th century. And it happened again with Hitler, and it happened again with Stalin, and with every single totalitarian regime that came. The Chinese, their revolution was called the Cultural Revolution of Chairman Mao, and they the first thing to do was to cancel culture. Was to cancel what is here, what is part of our hearts, our way of life. And another thing I would like to mention is that next spring here in France there's going to be a presidential election, and I'm observing the various people who are contending for the big job to be president of France. I try to keep away from politics as much as possible, but there are some there are some things of great concern, and our greatest concern should be the preservation of our culture, of our ethnic culture, because we too are ethnic people. I'm English, but I'm also European. And there's one of the candidates for the presidential next year is Eric Zemmour, and I'm very, very mixed about. Have very mixed feelings about him. Of course, the press and the media would call him a fascist or many other things, but he says exactly the opposite of cancel culture. We have to maintain and protect and nourish our culture. I don't know. I'm not going to say which way other people should vote. France is in a particularly difficult situation politically, with the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, who tend to represent the ordinary French person who is struggling to make a living, and who finds that social services are taking more and more of our money and giving us less and less services. And so there is a big problem in France. And I think that, well, my own role in this, I'm not a politician, I'm not an activist. The best thing I can do is to do what I'm doing now, is to write, to play the organ, to give little speeches and reflections, to say that the hour is grave. We have a lot to worry about. At the same time, God is within us. God is there, also far beyond us in transcendence, but He is also within us. And He will bring us through this ordeal, as He took the children of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land, or from Babylon, the second exile. And somehow God will bring us home, and we will find the fullness of what we desired and aspired to for our whole lives.